Well, thank you for that introduction. It's pretty much as I wrote it, really. Let me say, as an Essendon supporter, we just happen to have the best pharmacist in all of Australia, and you other clubs, go find your own pharmacist. I'm delighted to be here. I got in yesterday from Manila, so I'm a little jet-lagged, but I always try and take the opportunity to speak to teachers. The main reason is that I am who I am because of gifted and quite inspired educators in my life. There's no question about that in terms of who I am today and who were the people who opened up questions of curiosity, who did very simple things. I remember in Year 9 asking a question, and a teacher surprised me by saying, "That's a fantastic question. I don't know the answer. Let's work together on finding the answer." I remember that moment as if time stopped. I had asked a fantastic question. A teacher didn't know the answer and was humble enough to admit it. A teacher actually said, "Education isn't about me, the authority figure, and you who will sit there and learn. It's actually about us together going on a journey to find an answer." That wasn't how I thought teachers reacted and responded. My question has been a life question for me. It was, why do so many people in the world have far more than they need? And why do far more people miss out on the very basics? Why is the world structured this way? Does it need to be structured this way? That question, by the way, has energized my whole life. It's the question I've stayed close to. Soren Kierkegaard in a book said, "Stay close to your bliss." He said every human has a particular question that fascinates them, that irritates them, that relentlessly niggles away at them. And your bliss is actually answering that question. Well, it was a Year 9 teacher that, for me, took my question seriously. I love talking to teachers because my whole life has actually been around teachers. My parents were teachers, one in the private system, one in the state system. A bit like the children they produced, we're evenly balanced in all sorts of ways. I married a woman who is a teacher. My sister's a teacher. My youngest son, is a teacher. In fact, after doing law, I trained as a teacher myself. I figured that's actually the family script. 6 weeks of teacher training in the classroom convinced me law was a very good idea. In fact, I decided that ending world poverty was probably an easier challenge than teaching. I say that seriously. I discovered how difficult it is to actually be responsible for discipline and modelling and exempling, for responsibility to really know which buttons to push to motivate young people, to open up curiosity. I think it is one of the most extraordinary professions and the most difficult. I don't know why teachers aren't paid more than Macquarie bankers. When you ask why parents make the most incredible sacrifices in their lives, working hard, they'll always answer to give our children the best chance. You'll ask, what do you mean? They'll say the best education. And when you start to say, well, what gives them the best education? The answer almost invariably is, well, the best teachers, the best school culture, the best opportunity for them to flourish. If this is the energy that drives so much hard work in this society, why aren't teachers recognised both socially and in terms of remuneration as at the highest part of that pinnacle? I don't quite get the economics. Well, for me, I think teachers are inspired to do what they do because they believe in the future. They believe in a future represented by the young people they work with. I think all educators are leaders by definition. To stand in front of a class, to think intentionally about those individual needs is actually, I think, the highest form of leadership. Leadership is saying, in whatever sphere you're in, business or politics, not-for-profit, how do I get the best out of this team? What is possible to do together? How do I get into alignment? Well, every teacher, I think, actually focuses on those questions with their class. It's an extraordinary leadership opportunity, even if it's incredibly difficult. So difficult, I moved on to law. I think it's unfortunate that often positions of leadership come with terrible constraints. Sometimes the constraints that great teachers have to be full-time administrators. I think it's really important that everyone in leadership finds time and space to centre their minds and think through how they're leading, how they're shaping those people for a better future. That's a really important question. Hopefully a motivating question, a blissful question for teachers. So educators all have the responsibility of seeing a vision of the future and of helping those they're training, teaching, to see it also. Good teachers do it every day in the classroom. It's a daily priority for people in positions of leadership as well. So, having said that the community needs to value teachers more, I think in times of change, true leaders aren't timid. We're all too easily drawn into behaviour that's safe, risk-averse. I think teachers, as leaders, need a reasonable appetite for reasonable risk, to be bold without becoming reckless or foolhardy. The basis for being bold without being foolhardy lies in the concepts of having a vision and having a sense of rational optimism. By rational optimism, I don't mean wishful thinking. It's not a blind faith. It's not closing our eyes and hoping for the best, namely our problems will go away if our eyes are closed. It's not complacency. Rational optimism depends on a fair and balanced appreciation of our challenges, coupled with a belief that we have the resources and the capability to apply them in ways that will make a real difference. In education, I think this gives us grounds for a positive approach. I think leaders in education, whether it's the same as business, government, civil society, need to be future-focused and visionary. That, I think, is the essence of leadership. In many cases, of course, schools have become large-scale businesses in their own right. For principals and leaders in schools, I think to be a true leader is to avoid only being a business manager. Businesses need to be managed well, schools need to be managed well. But leadership goes a step further. It is combining those business skills with some traditional virtues. Virtues of saying, let's open up the question, let's see what the challenges are, let's prepare young people for a future that isn't the same as the past, that is more dynamic and is more global. Well, to do that, you do need clarity of vision, to reassure, to inspire. You do need communication. It's a very primary skill set. Every teacher, by definition, if they're a good teacher, works on their communication skills. A leader is only as good as the following they command. Everything depends not just on your ability to have a vision, but to articulate it, to communicate it, to inspire others through the way you communicate to see that vision. So I think educational leaders need to be active and articulate champions for the work they do. They need to see that education is fundamental for embracing the future, enabling young people who are imbibing a global consciousness to have global competencies that the future will demand, that need traditional knowledge, but alongside it, need to apply that traditional knowledge to fast-moving currents that globalisation is producing. So, let me try and talk about that in terms of a transformed global society, global economy, global culture that are shaping our world. We're not just in a time of change, we're in a time of transition. Transition is that sense of moving to a different way of being because of globalisation. And we still need fundamental values in this time of transition. You can't Google for social justice. You actually have to practice it. You have to learn by doing. You have to engage in it. I've been following through my friends the cases of two young Vietnamese boys here at Woodville High, on the run, in hiding, from a government that seems to be incredibly harsh and mean to me. Here is Australia, the second wealthiest per capita nation on the world. Switzerland's number one in medium per capita wealth. Medium's the right measure, not average, because medium excludes Gina and James Packer. In terms of medium per capita wealth, we are the second wealthiest in the world. When it comes to health and safety and community, there's a measure called the Human Development Index. On the Human Development Index, we are second only to Norway in the world. When it comes to health, we're second. When it comes to wealth, we're second. We're healthy, we're wealthy. What profoundly disturbs me is, are we wise? Are we wise? Have we kept enough perspective to recognise we don't have to be mean and have random cruelness? We don't have to set up a false debate between lifters and leaners. This is an old debate of the deserving, undeserving poor. The idea that givers are morally superior to takers. That we can have, as long as we declare there was equality of opportunity, the most outrageous material inequality, a growing gap between rich and poor in Australia, and say, no problem, as long as there was equality of opportunity. Well, equality of opportunity, of course, has always assumed this rather fanciful notion that we all start at the same starting line. And in the race of life, some are just faster and some are cleverer, and that's why you get a huge blowout of material difference. Now, a free society can absolutely tolerate differences materially. There is a truth that in life's opportunities, some will be smarter and quicker and better. But the equality of opportunity argument is living with a false assumption that we're all at the same starting line. We know that when it comes to education and student disadvantage in Australia, there isn't the same starting line. We know that when it comes to birth, there isn't the same starting line. World Vision exists to challenge the great lottery of latitude that says if you're thrown on the stage of life called the Philippines that I flew in from yesterday, or Mozambique or East Timor, an hour's flight from Australia, unlike Australia, you weren't guaranteed universal education, clean water, universal health. I know there's a discussion here whether we're losing universal health with co-payments, but by and large, universal health. We don't choose the stage of life we're thrown up on. If it's here, our starting line is way ahead in the race of life of those behind. And even here, we know, with the growing wealth disparity, this idea that we've all had equality of opportunity because we're all at the same starting line and therefore there should be no questioning the blowouts in material difference isn't actually true. So, to educate means to have a clear sense of where you stand on some of these issues, what your values are, how students should be encouraged to actually look at the world how it is, including their world, and dare to know, ode sapere, dare to know, dare to ask the question, why is it structured this way? Isn't politics at the end of the day pretty simple? Politics at the end of the day is about who has power and gets what they want, and who doesn't have power and misses out. In looking at this budget, and I'm rather emboldened hearing, you're a bureaucrat, aren't you? A politician. No? What are you? A bureaucrat. Fancy a bureaucrat saying, I'm going to tell you the truth. I'm going to put away spin. I thought, gee, if a bureaucrat can do that, well, here I go. Politics in this budget seems to have given Australians this wake-up moment. I can tell you, because I know a few politicians, that most budgets are forgotten within 2 days of them being brought down. Most people can't quite remember. There might be one thing that affected them. 5 months on, I have never seen engagement around this budget like now. It was built on 2 assumptions. The first assumption was we've got a budget emergency, and people said, hang on, emergency is a bit like fire, run, it's a disaster. We have a budget structural problem. Is it an emergency? And the second and more profound premise was, and we're all sharing the pain equally. Now, Australians have actually said, hang on, here are under 30s who aren't going to be on New Start for 6 months, that critical time in life when they're really trying hard and they can't pay their food and rent unless they've got a family paying it for them. Here's university fees that are going to go up. Here's co-payments. Here's foreign aid, and because Australians were hurt, poor old foreign aid, which cost 20% of the budget cuts. So of the $35 billion in Joe's budget, 20% was cut in foreign aid, literally costing lives, literally. And there are refugees almost alongside foreign aid, which are on one side of a column of suffering but illegitimate. On the other side of the column are legitimate suffering, students, people under 30, the sick, the aged pensioners. But whether it's one side of the column or the other, Australians have said, hang on, I'm not sure we're sharing the pain fairly. If politics is about who's got power and gets what they want, how come 50% of super benefits flow and super concessions to the top 10% richest in Australia? Hang on, what about negative gearing? Sure, maybe a second house, but there are people with 10 houses paying no tax. Hang on, how is it possible for Australian companies to be making huge profits and be paying virtually no tax? Who is sharing the pain? Well, these are questions that require students being given the freedom to ask. When we think about the transition to globalism, it goes beyond just those Australian questions. In classrooms and staff rooms around Australia, with the avalanche of horrific news streaming in, I'm sure you as teachers are asking, should a newspaper be able to publish a front-page picture of a child holding a severed head, even if it's pixelated? I hope you're asking the question, why does a massive famine in South Sudan, where thousands are dying, deserve less attention than a plane crash over Ukraine? To ask how and is it possible to talk about the Israeli-Gaza conflict without being accused of partisanship? I'm seeing Daniel Milkey after this, the coffee owner down at wherever he is, Norwood, is it? he wanted to do something about this and sort of stumbled into paying for some ads with the Adelaide Crows, who said fine. The AFL said no, raising Gaza is political. He then rang me and I said, well, World Vision's working there. We've lost a number of sponsored children. If it's World Vision's name associated, that should be okay, Daniel. Still, the AFL said no, Gaza is too political. Too political. Isn't the magnificent work the AFL does with Aboriginal reconciliation political? Isn't a host of other things political? When is it possible to say something about children in Gaza without being accused of taking sides? Even worse, being accused of being anti-Semitic in taking sides. These are difficult questions, and students in a globalised world need to be asking them, to be daring to know, to have a learning environment where questions are prompted, encouraged, tossed around. What sets apart this current period of difficult events prompting difficult questions is the way that education in the 21st century fosters strong critical skills, hopefully coupled with information and some of the communications overload, the noise, at least being sifted, having the skills to sift it. The thing about a library and books is there's been an editor who's got rid of the chaff before the book has been published. The trouble with the net is there's so much chaff. There's no editor. There's so much assertion. There's so many scary things. Having the ability that comes through teachers being able to develop critical skills, asking the right questions, seeing through. Well, the world is undergoing a transformation. It's economic, it's political, it's cultural, it's at the same time technological, personal and spiritual. It's a phenomenon happening on a global scale. It's affecting all of humanity, the rise of globalisation. First 9/11, then the subsequent period of wars and discontent, then the global financial crisis. These have caused many people to doubt that a global future is really possible or even desirable. At the moment, there is a turn inwards. This is where religion as an identity marker is growing stronger as people turn inwards who say, we don't like globalisation, we're just going to look after our own mob. When it comes to foreign aid, the Australian public are going, well, charity begins at home. I do discover, by the way, most people who say that are the people who give the least charities at home. The leave pass is often an excuse. Having worked in a domestic charity for 20 years, I absolutely believe charity begins at home. But the old saying, charity begins at home, actually meant charity is learnt at home. If you don't learn it at home, you won't feel it for anywhere else. If we believe in universal human rights, as I do, it means that someone hungry and homeless anywhere in the world has an ethical tug on me as much as someone hungry and homeless here. That's what indivisible, universal human rights actually mean. But in a globalised world which is all too scary, we turn inwards. We push aside others. That's what the refugee, asylum seeker debate is about. We say it's just about us. We lose perspective. I realised how much we had lost perspective when I heard Joel Fitzgibbon, then a secretary in the Gillard government. He was really doing the numbers for Rudd, having a shot at Gillard, who was mooting raising taxes on people earning more than $250,000 a year. Joel Fitzgibbon said, I know a lot of Australians on $250,000 a year who are really struggling. That's when I realised we'd completely lost it. This is a Labor politician. Let me just explain. If you're on $250,000 a year, you're in the top 1% of income earners in Australia. Sure, if you meet James Packer or Gina, you feel like you're struggling. The truth is you didn't get poorer, you're still in the top 1%. If you're 6'4" and a man, you're in the top 1% of tallest men in Australia. If you meet an NBA basketballer who's 7 foot, you suddenly feel really small. The truth is you didn't shrink. You're still in the top 1%. That's what perspective is. This profound loss of perspective when we're the second richest per capita, the second healthiest, this justification that we can be therefore turning inwards and mean, has been driven by some of the fear of globalisation. 9/11, financial crisis, too many disasters. Well, we know that globalisation isn't linear. It's not always unifying. It does provoke counter-reactions. It does give rise to often local identity and very fearful, tribal, turning inwards local identity. And it does start to beat the drum of nation state. We'll just pull up the drawbridge in Australia. Let me explain that most of our federal politicians, when they say they will make a difference, are doing that for brand distinction to win your vote in an election. They cannot make a difference. The levers of power are no longer with the nation state. We've floated the dollar. The market determines the dollar. We have handed even monetary policy over to the Reserve Bank, independent, that will decide the interest rates and the amount of liquidity, of cash we allow. When it comes to international flows of investment, to international flows of pollution, this is what the climate change debate's about, nation states do not have the levers anymore. We are in a global world. It means the students you're preparing aren't just competing with the best schools here in Adelaide or even in Melbourne. They're competing with the best schools in Sydney and Jakarta and San Francisco. We are living in a global world. Well, this tide of globalisation continues to roll on. In the economy, Christmas sales performances here in Adelaide will depend on the Chinese demand for building supplies. That's what will determine Christmas sales, a global market, economically. This globalisation means we're travelling much more than before, physically and virtually, and it will increase despite moments of turning inwards over the coming decades. It's not just an economic trend, it's a technological trend. As you know, the speed of social media has intensified at a volume no one could imagine. There are now far more mobile phones in Africa than there are in Europe. It's actually giving Africa a chance. Farmers who are illiterate can memorise the 9 digits, can actually ring for weather reports and price reports of when they should sell their crops. It's actually giving empowerment in many, many areas. Well, in this content-saturated world, of course we need to equip young people, starting from well before their journey through high school, with the ability and the values to navigate the information age. We need explicit teaching on the difference between fact and opinion, the difference between fact and marketing, the difference between fact and propaganda, and to raise the question that even labelling something a fact is often a subjective decision. It's harder. Once we had far more journalists who were news reporters, very few of those now. Now we have far more columnists. Columnists are cheap. They actually will give you their columns for nothing because they want to get published. They're expressing opinion. The Australian has lots of them, the Murdoch press. They are expressing opinions which often are dressed up as facts. Young people, with your help, need to be able to understand the difference between someone who takes an opinion, the Australian says, we're right of centre, we will prosecute that line, They'll say the ABC is left-wing. Certainly Fairfax is left of centre opinions. How are they able to separate fact and opinion? Well, let me pull this together by saying educating for new times is really important. There still is an education deficit. 30 million children of primary school age around the world are not attending school at all. We know that many people are pouring across borders with greater ease because parents, and this is the engine of human history, have always been prepared to take incredible risks, to make huge personal sacrifices for one thing, just so their kids get a better chance and opportunity than them. Think of your parents, think of your grandparents. Incredible sacrifices to their own lifestyle just so their kids will get a better chance. That actually has been the engine that has driven innovation and change and even prosperity. Those risks and that spirit. In many countries, though, where World Vision works, there's a lag between economic improvements and the scaling up of education systems. Girls still miss out in far too many cases. But having said that, we are starting at last to see progress on the long road to gender parity in education. In a world where information on any subject can be found with the click of a mouse or the tap of a finger, I think it's really important that young people learn they cannot Google for the truth. That search, that value, actually has to be learnt by looking at their own values, asking critical questions, journeying with tools that separate and blow away the chaff to find the truth. Real social justice is achieved by real people seeking the truth in this world. You see it in the explosion of young entrepreneurs starting up social businesses, social enterprises, not-for-profit businesses. My son Elliot is one. He's named his restaurant Feast of Merit after my latest book, Hope. In Hope, I tell the story of being in Nagaland and being quite surprised that there in northeast India, high in the mountains, the 40 tribal indigenous groups have retained their culture, language, sense of pride, represented in their clothes. Teachers wear blue and they wrap around massive cloaks with beautiful tapestry. Lawgivers wear red, massive cloaks. It's high up and so very cold. On my second day there, I saw someone wearing a gold coat and I was so taken, I said to my Naga host, wow, that's a knockout. What role do they have? What status do they have? A gold coat. And my Naga host said, oh, well, that's someone who's thrown a Feast of Merit. When I said, Feast of Merit, what does that mean? They said, oh, in Naga culture, when you become rich, you can choose to throw a feast for the whole village, called a Feast of Merit. It's particularly focused on the poor. You boil up all your rice. You kill all your pigs. The feast goes 2 weeks, 4 weeks, however long it takes to liquidate all your assets. When all your rice is eaten, all your pigs have been eaten, the community dances and celebrates. When everything is gone, you're given a gold coat and you start again with nothing. I said, I'm pretty sure we don't have Feasts of Merit in our culture. I thought, isn't this interesting? Here is a culture that's remembered something very profound. We brought nothing into this world. We're taking nothing with us when we leave. Sure, we can leave it to our kids, but if we leave too much, we'll probably ruin them. The whole point of wealth is for relationships, for celebration, to bless the poor, to make a difference now. Isn't that the point? Here is a culture that's discovered that. Well, my son has started a social business. He started a coffee shop in Burke Street. Now he's got a restaurant in Swan Street, Richmond in Melbourne, called Feast of Merit. The story's written up on the menus on the side of the building, and all the profits go to their work in Cambodia and Ghana. New forms of social initiative and enterprise. Young people, and many of my son's age have been this, who've gone off for the holiday in Thailand and started to feel a bit guilty after the Phuket beaches of seeing so many poor and going, how do we party when this is going on? He's about to launch a campaign that's called Polish Man. He's got some of the footballers, Chris Judd, Jobe Watson, wearing a polished nail, focusing on men saying no to violence against children because of what he saw with trafficked kids in Cambodia, in Thailand. Young people, shaped, experiencing the world, saying globalisation absolutely means a responsibility beyond just here, and starting businesses. Part of my work in World Vision is taking executives into slums. Earlier this year, I took the executives of one of our biggest insurance groups. There in the slum where World Vision works in Mumbai, where that film was made, Slumdog Millionaire, crowded into a room where about 200 kids, not much bigger than the stage I'm standing on, and 6 executives, the AIG group. When they'd been in the slum for an hour, the smell, the heat, the intensity, they just wanted to get out. I said, no, you've paid a lot of dollars for this experience. Let's see the afternoon through. Well, they got to this youth program we were running after seeing the livelihoods and other stuff, and sweat was pouring off them. Kids that were really in this very small space who were singing and dancing and showing some of the things they do in the slum. And I asked the question to the kids, what do you like about the slum? Curious question, what do you like about a slum? These execs and I just want to get out. And out of these kids pours spontaneously unity, play, solidarity, care. We look after each other. I looked at some of the execs. Tears were rolling down their faces. Tears. And as we did retreat, of course, back to the 6-star Taj Hotel to do the debrief, they just talked about the profound impact what those kids had said had on them. The joy, the fun, the care for one another. And they reflected on their own lives, how driven they are, how time poor, relationship poor they were, asking a pretty profound question. They're very materially poor, we're not, but we are poor. We suddenly were confronted with our own poverty. Realising that these questions in a globalised world are opportunities to go on a journey, to find a deeper and truer self. Well, I could talk, but time has gone, about why technological change is now not just the provision of the Western advantage, that so much is technological change is giving opportunity to those in the developing world. But let me finish by saying I am still astonished that many policymakers, including those at government levels, don't appreciate the significance and critical role education plays. I'm still quite staggered that people want to count the cost of education, forgetting that education is an investment that always has a return when it's done with teachers who have commitment and who are leaders. We treat education as if it's just another form of consumption, not an investment in future prosperity and well-being. We have ridiculous culture wars over education. You're aware of them. There's too much in the syllabus about environmentalism or Indigenous or other cultures. Too little about Western civilization. Too little about Anzac and the sacrifice of the nation. I'm sure as parents stand at the school gates, you hear them complaining all the time their kids aren't hearing enough about Western civilization and the Anzac story. We seem to pop up these sort of false debates in a globalised world. Now, the Anzac story is important. Mind you, I don't think there's too little of it. I think Anzac Day with the shrine to the mighty dead is the holiest day in the Australian calendar now. Its own music, the last post and the reveille. Its own liturgy, Lawrence Binion and Rudyard Kipling's words, lest we forget at the going down of the sun. I think it's become an extraordinary sacred moment. I'm not always comfortable with it, I'll admit, in this cultural debate. Do we really believe without the shedding of blood there can be no birth of a nation? I suspect there's too much at the heart of this debate around the symbols there. I often wonder when young people say, oh yes, what's Anzac Day mean? They died so we can be set free. Well, we're going off to fight the Turks. The Turks. Imagine if Japanese decided that Darwin, where they attacked in the Second World War, was a holy site for them. And every year, tens of thousands of young Japanese came to Darwin to have a symbolic that this was the birth of their nation. Interesting. Not sure how we'd feel. That's equivalent to what happens at Gallipoli. Now, that's not to say we must not honour and pay respects, but in discussing these ideas, we need to be allowed to ask critical questions. Well, the educational enterprise is profoundly important in its leadership, in its focus, in its ability to say in a globalised world, to have that vision, to be able to discern, to ask those critical questions, is the gift that you as teachers give to kids. Let me finish by one final story that comes from my book, Hope. And there are a few copies of my book here if anyone would like them. The person who had the greatest educational impact on me wasn't a teacher, it was my maternal grandmother. She had to leave school in grade 6 to go to work. And yet she was the best educated person I've ever known. She could recite poetry for hours and hours. She would devour books. She would be giving them to us to read. She always would discuss these books with us. She would write letters to us, beautiful letters. That's the problem with email, have you noticed? Who's going to collect bound volumes of emails in the future and put them in libraries? She would have us over on weekends and have us cooking all day Saturday. Not much fun when you're a 10-year-old boy and wants to be playing cricket and footy. And I remember we'd be taken to church on Sunday, have Sunday roast with her, and then she'd pack all this excess food into baskets. And with us in train, she'd head out into her community in Melbourne, and she'd deliver casseroles and food, all the stuff we'd cooked on Saturday, to people who, in her words, were doing poorly. Today we'd say depressed, shut in, sick. They were doing poorly. And I remember saying to Grandma, why are we doing this? You don't even know some of these people. She just heard at church or in her community or she was a member of the Liberal Party. In her party, she'd heard about people who were doing poorly. And I'll never forget what she said. She said, Tim, this is what it means to live in community. Here was a sense that even if I don't know them personally, I have a responsibility. She'd write a note if they weren't home, maybe knock and say, you don't know me, but I heard just thinking of you, and leave something. It had a profound impact on me because she wasn't just a great teacher, she lived out her values. It reminds me that you as teachers when you have 20 sets of eyes looking at you, it's not just the mind that you're shaping. For some of those kids, the classroom may actually be the safest place in life for them, given some of the family homes they come from. When they watch you, they're watching how an adult deals with frustration and discipline and irritation, and hopefully does that still with dignity, still respecting, though disciplining an individual. How you deal with conflict, because they've come from situations where it's dealt with in unacceptable ways. Your formation, just as my grandma's formation on me, is as critical as your knowledge. Well, my grandmother had a stroke at the age of 84. She fell into a coma, and she was in it for 10 days and then died. The only words she said in the coma were the words, "Don't forget to water them geraniums." Puzzling, because though she had a garden, she didn't have any geraniums. We didn't know what she was meaning. Something's dislodged in the brain. She's in a coma. Well, the funeral was packed out the door. How many 84-year-olds have packed funerals in a big church? So many people who knew of her, who came and respected her. I was only 24 then and was very privileged to be one of the speakers giving a eulogy. She'd had a huge impact on me. It wasn't until a few weeks after the funeral that my aunt, Mum's sister, discovered a Henry Lawson story called Water Them Geraniums. None of us ever remember her reading it to us. A story of a woman who's a battler in the bush, raising a tribe of kids on her own, dirt poor, missing husband, not told, deserted, died, missing father figure in so much of bush life. The one thing she's proud of are her geraniums. She's raising this tribe of kids, her story told through the eyes of a rich neighbour, a selector. And then in the story, like so many melancholic Lawson stories, she's struck down with an illness, a terminal illness. As the reader, you think, the panic in her mind, when I'm gone, no social security, who'll feed these kids? Who'll clothe these kids? Who'll educate these kids? And then the story finishes with her kids gathered around her bed as she dies. And her final words to her children are, "Don't forget to water them geraniums." I realised even from her deathbed in a coma, my grandma was still teaching, passing on her values, saying, whoever you are, whatever money you make, whatever fame you make, actually, that's not the measure of whether you're a big person. The real measure is how you live out your values, how you live out what you really believe, how you do those pedestrian daily things. You as teachers, living out who you are, not just as educators, but how you relate, are shaping, forming in a globalised world. My encouragement is to keep watering them geraniums. Thank you.